first of all, Antonis, thank you for doing this.
Pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have you. For people tuning in, listening, I'm hoping you wouldn't mind giving a little brief description of kind of who you are and what you're doing at the moment.
Sure. So I'm Antonis Kousoulis. I'm director at the Mental Health Foundation. So I oversee our research and our services and policy work across England and Wales. I've been with the foundation for about 4 years. I'm a public health doctor by background. The foundation is a 70-year-old charity. So
it's been going since the 1940s, is it?
1949, yeah.
Wow.
So about as old as the NHS and one of the oldest mental health charities in the world. But we are really focusing on preventing problems and policy change and looking at the whole structures of society when it comes to mental health. So we take a very holistic approach.
Okay. When you say holistic, because we've been speaking obviously before this podcast, it's something I've wanted to do for a long time. Obviously, I'm in music. I've been involved with all sorts of dramas with mental health going on. I was fascinated by what you said in terms of, well, two things that you said. Number one was this concept of prevention, and two, when you say holistic, because I'm trying my best to understand as much as I can about this. And when you talk about prevention, what is it that comes to mind first when it comes to preventing this stuff? I wouldn't have thought it's necessarily a preventable thing, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think that this is a common misconception that we carry as a society, and it is probably a symptom of the fact that we never really understood mental health and mental illness until maybe the last 10 or 20 years. We're really increasing our understanding. So we thought that mental illness is something you are born with. So you have some kind of deficiency in the brain, and it means that some people are born like that and others are not. And it's just a matter of luck and genes and biology. But the evidence now is overwhelming that this is not the case.
And just to cut in there, so there isn't really a genetic or biological predisposition.
So there is a predisposition, but we are not, if you like, victims of our genes. So we are not born ill. And to a large extent, our biology interacts with our environment and our experiences and the stuff that we are exposed to that could be a risk to our mental health. And this is how we develop mental health problems. So some people have a predisposition, and that makes them more vulnerable, if you like, from a genetic perspective, from a biological perspective. But there has to be an environmental aspect. There has to be, an experiential element to it.
Am I right in drawing the conclusion that is what you're saying, that the biological elements that have an effect, are they at least understood fairly well at this point? So you're saying that there is a genetic and biological aspect, but you understand them enough to say, hey, that's not really the key player here. It's a lot more to do with your social environment, the way you were brought up. That's kind of what we're getting at.
We do understand them enough. We're not necessarily able to pinpoint, specific genes to specific conditions, or there is some research around that. But we are able to say that you have to have this combination of factors. So we do understand that. And I think the moment you start taking this approach and understanding what that means, then you say, oh, actually, if there is an environmental element to it, that means potentially if we stop that, some people would not develop those mental health problems. So this is where prevention comes into play. Okay.
Do you have an example of that? I'm struggling to get my head around what you mean by that.
Yeah. So there is a growing, if you like, trend and conversation in our sector about how a lot of mental illness is actually a symptom of our society. So if you see someone who works in a job that has a lot of demands and they have very little control over this job, and maybe there is bullying happening at the same time in the workplace, you can immediately understand high levels of stress for that person. So if they stay at these high levels of stress for some time, then they might develop, what we call anxiety, which is a more sort of clinical term. So a person who is exposed to this stress, the stress interacts with their genetic predisposition. It might trigger a gene, it might express a gene in a different way, it might impact on some of the structures in our brain, and this will respond by providing some symptoms of anxiety or depression or whatever else. So it's that interplay between stress is a usual example, but it's quite a key one. So in this case, interplay between stress and our biology.
Okay, there was something you said there about the control factor, which is something I've been thinking about a while. And again, you can kind of tell me whether I'm on the right lines there, but are you maybe alluding to that when people are in these environments where they're under particular, like large amounts of stress, the factor of control might be really, really important? For example, if someone is under quite a lot of stress because they're working and achieving things that they're relatively in control of, that might be quite different to someone who is exhibiting similar levels of stress, but they actually don't have fundamental control of what they're achieving. Like, maybe, am I getting that right? Is that important?
This is an important factor, especially when you think about the workplace and people's jobs more generally, but also in our day-to-day lives. Covering our fundamental needs. If we have control over, are we able to put food on the table for tomorrow? For our kids or whatever else, or do we need to count each pound? Until it gets us to the end of the month. This is a very different sort of life situations. But I think when we think about creative industry and think about musicians and others, what's your experience? I think this level of display between stress and control and unpredictability, I think that must be quite strong, isn't it?
I mean, it fascinates and terrifies me. Like on a very personal level, there is a beauty, I think, in being on my own, independent. I have friends in major labels, and I think this element of control is something that I find quite fascinating because, it's not an easy job, but I'm also very grateful for it. It's an amazing job to have. In those periods of my career where you start to enter the unknown, where maybe you're doing things and you're working towards a goal, but the things that you're doing aren't manifesting the things you would expect them to. There's a real disparity that happens, and maybe not just with musicians, but that is something that I've felt before. I think I'm quite blessed, really, in a way that I haven't personally been too affected by mental illness. I've have plenty of people around me that have, which isn't statistically surprising, I'm sure. But that's why the first thing that's hooked me, and when I listen to you talk and I listen to you explain this stuff, this is kind of why I wanted to do it, because this element of control is really important, particularly in music. Obviously, that's my background, but to the wider community, I think that's a really big thing that we're not maybe not understanding or maybe not respecting. And for example, when I've done my limited amount of research here, because I've kind of just gone over some rough things, I'm also fascinated by the relationship of relative poverty to depression. You take really struggling areas, and you can even extrapolate out to third world countries, and it seems like depression is being bred in these what's the word I'm looking for, like in these affluent grounds almost. Does that make sense? It's like in a more middle class society to upper class societies, it seems to be more prevalent as I learn and understand more about it, which the whole thing confuses the hell out of me.
So this is not entirely true. So okay. I'll have to challenge that sort of in a positive way, because the research on on the whole of mental illness. So if you take depression, you take anxiety, you take schizophrenia, things that a lot of people understand less well. There is what we call, I'll use some jargon here, the social gradient. So social gradient is that in each step of, let's take the UK example. We have these indices of deprivation. So there are sort of 10 steps, for example, right? So with each step of this index that you go up to, fewer people actually experience mental illness. It's the same in depression, anxiety, and all of the kinds of mental health. And
forgive
problems.
me, the index you're saying was from what to what? Sorry.
So say from 1 to 10.
On a scale of not exhibiting.
On a scale of being of being in poverty to a scale of being in a very affluent, part of a very affluent community.
Yeah.
So you see the more you're moving towards poverty, the more we're seeing these stats, bigger numbers of people experience mental health problems.
Oh wow! So I've got
actually,
that
so
totally
it's actually the opposite, and there are various explanations for that. But that this sort of poverty and social inequality is a really big driver of mental illness these days.
Why do you think that is? Is that purely down to financial pressures?
So financial pressures is one. So that fundamental day-to-day stress of just getting things done with limited means. So this is quite important. The second one is access to various, what we would say protective or positive things for our mental health that is quite limited if you don't have the means. The third is that if you look at poorer communities, if you look at communities that don't have the same access to income and savings and things like that, they tend to concentrate in neighborhoods that are also maybe less well looked after, and these are the neighborhoods also that where we see more violence, where we see more unrest, and violence is linked to experience of trauma. So if you're a victim of violence, if you're in a neighborhood that you witness violence, this brings trauma, and trauma is again a huge factor contributing to mental health problems. So there's a combination of factors that we would call environmental, if you like, are related to where you live and sort of what kind of means you have.
Going to what you were saying before about the sheer length of time you've been doing this. Obviously across England and Wales, you're looking at all regions in the UK, you're trying to understand the statistics of where these main problems are. Since the 1940s, this organisation's been doing what it's doing. Why such a huge increase? I mean, maybe there's some simplistic answers, and I don't want to just jump on the bandwagon of social media or XYZ, but from your knowledge and your understanding, why do you feel that there is such a heavy amount of panic and worry and concern happening now in this space?
There are two schools of thought on this, I should say. So one is that mental health problems have not increased, but we understand them better. We talk more about these. We record them better.
And
so
when you say we record them
increase.
better, so you've said that they haven't necessarily increased over this time. How do we measure that? I mean,
so that's the challenge of this school of thought, because data were not as good quality 70 years ago or 150 years ago or whatever else compared to what they are now. So this is one element of that. We usually tend to just measure how many people have a diagnosis. So this is the most usual kind of record that we have. This is what's measured in the NHS. It's what's measured in health systems internationally. But at the same time, there are some surveys and some studies that are conducted over time. And these actually show that certain groups have seen increases in mental health problems which cannot be justified just by recording issues.
Okay.
We've talked before about girls and young women, which is the group at the moment that sees the most rapid and most sort of dramatic increase in mental health problems.
I think that's another misinterpretation from me. I mean, part of this talk, part of what spawned this talk was hearing the statistic that I think suicide was the biggest killer of men between 18 and 35. That was something really shook me to my core. I thought, no, that can't be real. I remember when we spoke on the phone initially and you said, well, okay, it's a problem with men, but this was an even deeper problem, that you're saying that now something that's not necessarily that widely known is this really strong kind of horrifying trend with young women that's happening right now.
Yes, no, that's right. We're not, there are some interpretations of why suicide is more common among men. Some of the explanations are that, men are maybe more likely to complete suicide, but suicidal thoughts actually probably more common in women. Suicidal ideation, as we say. A second factor might be, a hugely protective factor for our mental health is sharing our emotions, and talking about our emotions. And for men, this is, we are brought up with boys don't cry, and if you talk about your emotions, that's weakness and things like that. So this sort of leads to those points of despair for many men, where sometimes women have better access to that protective element of conversation. And it might sound simplistic, but it is quite fundamental.
And I can see that for sure. I mean, with what I do, I spend a lot of time on my social media connecting with fans and supporters around the world. That's part of what I consider, a really big, important part of what I'm doing. And I've got to say, statistically, I have kind of about 60% female, 40% male listeners, and in my demographic. Yeah. And I have unfortunately had some messages that have come through from people who are really in trouble. It's always women who have expressed it and said, "Hey, look, I'm struggling. I feel lucky that they have an outlet, and without kind of putting too much pressure on you, but I also struggle to, and for maybe a lot of people listening, kind of struggle on how to approach that when someone does open up and say, hey, look, I've been going through a really rough time. I might be having these thoughts." That's a tricky thing, but it's never men, and you think about statistically, I know how many messages I get on this matter. Guys just don't do it. They don't reach out. They don't throw that rope out. But I suppose that's just because we're useless at communicating.
No, exactly. Yeah, and it's a combination of these factors. The women are more likely to reach out, and they're actually the problems are a little bit more common as well. So it's a combination of these, I would imagine. Yeah.
And what do you suggest that people do? Like, if people have had someone reach out to them, if someone has discovered that someone's struggling in that particular way, it's a very difficult situation to find yourself in. And I've got to be honest, I obviously worry, but I don't know what the best thing to do is with someone like that. I don't know whether responding and opening up a dialogue is necessarily the best thing. Do you know what I mean? It's tricky.
Yeah, I understand that. One of the reasons that for us more broadly, as a society, this is tricky is because we've never been taught to talk about these things and have these conversations. It's actually quite good to be able to have that conversation. So even if you're unsure, or anyone listening and thinking about how could I support someone, I just try to have a chat, acknowledge, how the other person is feeling, and that you are there for them, and that, it is important that they have opened up, that they've shared something. So that this is a hugely important first step for someone who is struggling and suffering. The fact that they will not be shamed, they will not be stigmatized, but on the other end of the line, or on the other end of the social media comment, there is
actually something that's okay, I understand that.
But more generally, I think I would encourage people to not try to necessarily play the expert. There are crisis lines, or Samaritan's line is quite commonly referred, but
that's where I referred to, and so that's probably a good place, because I find it an extremely difficult position to be in as an artist. I make music. I am not experienced in that field. And this is why I think this is why it hits a little deeper than most subjects, because when I have these conversations with people, and sometimes people turn to music, don't they, when they're going through these tough times. I just get what's the best way of putting it? I get bothered by the amount. I get bothered by the amount of people reaching out, and it's a big driver to doing this. And obviously, and thanking you for coming and doing this, because I wanted to have some kind of a platform where we can just dive in and dig in a little bit, and just try and understand it a little bit more. I mean, already I'm learning tons from you, and I have 101 questions that are sitting in the back of my mind. But as we start to go into what you were saying earlier about women, and I'm assuming we're talking young women, I'm assuming we're talking about relations with online bullying. Yeah, this is something that we can quite clearly point the finger to social media, or
partly. So social media, the difference that they've made are, I think, indisputable in some cases. So one thing is, for example, body image. Social media has fundamentally changed what we mean by the word image, right? The very word image means something completely different today than it meant 20 years ago. Cyberbullying is not entirely new, but we didn't have that before. Cyberbullying.
Oh, cyberbullying.
some some girls or boys that are bullied at home. Sometimes it doesn't at school. Sometimes it doesn't stop. It just carries on online. So some of these things
because
are
they
quite
can't
new.
escape it anymore. There's no escape from getting away from that. And I don't know whether I'm looking at things again in an overly simplistic way, but at least when I was younger, guys had a tendency to like get in a fist fight, like get that physical aggression out. And with women, as I learn more about it, it's really much more vindictive, isn't it? Like it's a lot more psychologically based warfare. Like it's pretty horrible stuff that goes on with girls in particular.
Yeah, I think that's right. It comes back to how, and this may be a little bit stereotypical, but it does actually come back to how different genders express emotions. So anger and aggression, it's quite a usual way for men to express other emotions that they don't really understand, that they hide inside. Whereas for women, they might be more direct, as you say, more vindictive. So it might be that kind of expression of distress or of other kind of annoyance that it just emerges like that.
And when we kind of consider the parallel that social media has to play, and again, from the outside looking in, it seems to me like social media has created this really peculiar fabric now where, like we say, we can't really escape it. I mean, I live through my phone. I'm on my phone all the time. And I see, 4 or 5 year olds now walking around with iPads. Like we've become bionic. They're almost an extension of our minds. And I wonder what our future is in attempting to control that and deal with that in terms of your preventative measures and understanding of what's going on. Or B, just kind of acknowledging the fact that is just part and parcel now of how we're going to evolve, and hopefully we evolve to deal with it. I've got kind of different varying school of thoughts all the time. Sometimes I think, well, is it going to be like smoking? Are we going to have like bans on the amount of time that people apply to social media? Is it going to be a case where, I don't know, maybe algorithmically stuff like Facebook, stuff like Instagram can be better at diagnosing people potentially at risk by the manner in which they use it? There's a lot of complicated things that I'm trying to like rationalize in my mind about the future of what's happening here.
I mean, these are all great thoughts. I wouldn't have one single answer to those. The fact of the matter is that these are, smartphones, social media, they're here to stay. They are globally, dominating, industries that are hugely influential in dominating the way that we live our day-to-day lives. It's unlikely that we'll be able to, achieve major influence on changing that. What we might be able to achieve is a little bit more regulation on the stuff that are really harmful.
And what do you mean by that?
Controlling and protecting people who are vulnerable online and express a vulnerability online, exposure to harmful content, so images that may be harmful or triggering or traumatic.
But this is a tricky one too. And the reason why I say that is because I'm really split on this idea. I deal in some respect with digital marketing. Like I kind of understand some basics of how this stuff works, and I had someone called Corinne Campbell on the podcast, the first episode actually I did, and we were discussing how algorithmic curation of people's news feeds is the norm now, right? So like people are going to have these curated news feeds they're going to go through. And as kind of weird as it is to say, I worry about the deeper problem that we might start to manifest in society by having this curation process of things that people see. I don't know really how to put it in words properly. Like I haven't really kind of solidified this concept, but like, do you know what I mean? It's like if we're now going to say, okay, I'm going to now judge what I think is harmful to you. I'm going to repress things that could be potentially triggering, and I'm going to make sure that your world that you exist in is always lovely and it's always perfect. Nothing's going to go wrong. Nothing's going to harm you. That sounds logically brilliant. It's like, well, obviously this is the sort of environment you want to bring up. But I mean, are you a parent? Do you have kids?
No, but I completely understand what you mean.
Because I mean, I don't either, but I do know that when my parents brought me up, their first thought wasn't to make sure that I was like as protected as possible. It was like, right, go and do dangerous shit, and sometimes things are going to go wrong. You're going to be exposed to things you don't like, and that's part of understanding your wider knowledge base to deal with the real world. So I don't know. I mean, I'm throwing a lot at you, but is there a potentially deeper problem with this idea of suppressing potentially harmful content?
I agree with that. And I think there will always be bumps on the road. There will always be, failures. We will always fail an exam. We will always get into, companies that might not be the best influence of us or whatever else. But there needs to be some kind of a line. And I think this is what we're missing at the moment. One of the things that I have a problem with, and especially if you look, in our conversation about girls and young women, they are exposed 24/7 to imagery and promotion from multiple industries, right, that try to constantly take advantage of all their insecurities to sell products. This is one contributing factor to why we see those mental health stresses and problems. So yes, there will be, girls and boys as well, that will always have insecurities. We will always care about, how we look and how our bodies are and things like that. We will always be stressed about our friends or anything like that in our exams. But we are putting, potentially 15-year-old girls, whatever, teenagers, university students, up against big industries that one of the main things they're doing is just taking advantage of insecurities. And I think these are areas where we need to draw a line.
I do agree with that. It is strange. I even remember feeling that even when I was really quite young. It's like everywhere you look, it's like photoshopped times 10. Everything is plastic. It feels strange. The thing that is going to be almost the impossible mountain to climb with that is, if we're going to have the freedom to have this kind of capitalist free market, how do we combat the fact that businesses that market like that, who exploit insecurities like that, because you're totally right, and I agree. It's like it's really simple. Exploit insecurities and tell people how this product can make it better, and it's horrendous. And obviously women are taking the brunt of that, and definitely more so men. I've started to notice, at least. I've definitely felt personally like a little bit more of a pressure now, because you can see that growing. But how do we have both? Like, what do you think the mechanisms could be? What are some ideas maybe to look at big business and say, okay, we've got to have some middle ground here, because at the moment we're way on the wrong side of the spectrum. Yeah. How do we start to bring that needle a bit more? I think there is sometimes a desire to oversimplify certain things, and I'm a public health doctor. I would like everyone to make mental health their business and really fight for good mental health. That's not going to happen. And I understand that there are industries and businesses that have to make profit, and this is how our world is shaped. So before we revolutionize everything, we need to start from trying to secure certain wins. At the very least, could we increase diversity in advertising? Could we diversify how what kind of bodies we have there, what kind of minorities are represented? Could we approach conversations in a different way? Could we use different language? We often use language that is exploitative, or is sometimes we use mental health terms. We use stress a lot. We use breakdown a lot. Words like that. So could we start changing some of these quite fundamental but maybe smaller elements of that, and make this a point of change? And I think there is. We did this survey last year, around body image, and one of the key negative influences that came up in our survey was images in fashion. And understandable.
It's just, I won't say they've come to the 21st century. I don't think that girls, and women want to look at perfectly shaped models to buy clothes anymore. I think we're way past that. Really, fashion needs to follow suit with the times. There are levels of activism these days and discussions that are much more sophisticated than what they think is still the case. So this would be my starting point. I mean, you work in a much more commercial space than I do, so I'm not sure what your view is more generally on that.
Well, I mean, firstly, I think what you're doing is great work, and that's part of why I wanted to connect with you anyway, personally, because I think, look, the fact that you're going out there, that you were starting to instigate these changes, the fact that you're looking across England and Wales and taking a systemic viewpoint in this and going, okay, well, where are the key parts in this process from someone essentially being born, being influenced, having potential genetic dispositions, and ending up on the wrong end of mental health. So I love the kind of approach you're taking here, and I just think that you have an impossible job almost. Kind of why I'm fascinated by it, because I want to understand it more, and I want to get my head into it more, and I want to do the most I can to try and selfishly get my head around it, but importantly, the people in my tribe and the people in my network and the supporters of my music who come, I want to try my best to do my part and start by talking about it. But sometimes I get this horrendous feeling that, is this going to be the new norm now? Is depression going to escalate in the death toll of men, young men? Are we going to see bullying getting more and more rife? Are we going to try and fix the problem by doing some of these measures, by suppressing content maybe, and in turn open up Pandora's box by creating more problems? So it's a twofold thing for me. It's fascination mixed with being concerned about the future.
So I feel I have to make this point, right? If you look at all these health issues that we consider common, so I'll give you some stats. Take how many people experience asthma. It's probably about 1 in 12. How many people experience diabetes? Maybe 1 in 16. How many people have dementia? 1 in 66, I think, or something like that.
1 in 66 people have dementia?
Yeah.
So that's a particularly personal one, because my granddad, he passed because of dementia, and it does run in our family. So I'm kind of quite hyper aware of all the things I can do in my life to step away from that. But sorry to take you off topic.
Yeah.
So
but it's a good point. It's a good point, because dementia is also linked quite often to mental health, and a lot of the things that are protective for our mental health are also protective against dementia, like how we eat and our exercise and our creativity and learning and
apparently being bilingual is a really big factor.
It is protective. It's a good factor.
And do we understand? I mean, I know we're slightly off topic there, but do we understand the mechanisms? Because I'm fascinated by that. You're saying if you're someone who's bilingual, your chances of experiencing or dementia are plummeting.
It's about, in simple terms, it's about training our brain and keeping our brain growing and learning and not staying
stagnant.
Yeah. So this is what's usually protective against dementia, and there is a also around the fact there's a genetic factor, and I'm not saying that everyone who eventually got dementia, they were not doing anything right or whatever, but there is an argument for, as I said before, where we live, there are circumstances. How do they allow us to do all these things that are protective? Well,
I'm sorry to take you off topic, because you were saying about the statistics, you were saying about the asthma, you were saying about
So if you think about some of these, and cancer, that we talk a lot about cancer these days. There used to be a stigma, but we talk a lot about cancer these days. About 1 in 25 people, right? So mental health problems are 1 in 6 every week.
Wow.
So this kind of rate is unacceptable in all other areas of health.
Now, to throw a spanner in your works, when it comes to mental health, and forgive me if I'm just, a little bit just getting the wrong end of the stick here, but it's a bit more spectral, isn't it? It's like, for example, you talk about cancer, you talk about diabetes, it's like, okay, here is a diagnosis. You have this condition, we can see it. But with mental health, it's a little bit of a wider spectrum, and would it be unfair to say that the diagnoses might be a little bit more, wide?
There are serious limitations and problems with the diagnostic framework, as we say in mental health, how we decide on a diagnosis, how is it set, how it is defined.
And I'm sure people are wondering the same thing.
Yeah.
It's just like, okay, I have a friend, or maybe I'm depressed myself. It's like, well, depression is a very, very relative term, isn't it? And at what point do you draw that line in the sand and go, okay, this is actually a clinical diagnosis?
This is a really important point that you're making. I think that the whole point of the spectrum and the subjectivity of the experience. There is, in clinical terms, there are maybe cutoff points on certain questionnaires that you can answer, or certain scales that we follow. but it's important to be able to differentiate between low mood and depression, stress and anxiety.
On that note, and I'm sorry I keep interrupting you. When you say the differences between stress and anxiety, there's always this clear barrier when you talk about this. How do you define them?
We all understand feeling low. We all understand being stressed. When you think about the clinical condition, like generalized anxiety disorder, as we say, or depression, it's the same with everything, I should say. It's the same when you think about psychosis. We all have some paranoid ideas. We all have, thinking of certain things. This doesn't make us, it doesn't put us in this category of experiencing psychosis. So it's across the whole spectrum. There are differences. Mental health problems, their definition is based on adding a level of disability. Essentially. So,
and then you run into tricky waters when you're trying to define that also.
Everything is tricky waters in mental health, unfortunately, because there is no single biological test that can take into account the whole range of human experience and distress. It's not, this is your biomarker for cancer. Do this blood test. We'll know if you're positive or not. It's much more complex because it's related to the human experience. But people who experience clinical depression or clinical anxiety would have a level of disabling factors in their day-to-day lives. They might not want to go out, just pick an example. They might not be able to get out of bed. It's the same with OCDs. We might like some things tidy. This doesn't mean that we experience obsessive compulsive disorder. So for some people, this is really disabling. They cannot really operate in the way that they would like. They could not be their see their full potential.
And that's the fundamental line in the sand. Is when you say, okay, this is now no longer feeling low. You are now actually incapable of doing anything, or okay, maybe that's too far.
But
you're now seeing a genuine effect on your life and an inability to do things. For example, I know people who are agoraphobic, and which is it was tough for me to get my head around it. I think I understand a little bit more about that mechanism now, but I found it strange to see what happened to this person when they were validated almost by this kind of diagnosis. And again, I that's not me. I'm trying to avoid being insensitive about this, because this is like someone who's really close to me. But the point is sometimes there does seem to be this validation that people take from going, okay, no, I've been diagnosed now, and maybe there's a vital element of just getting that disparity between the diagnosis and the person. It's like, look, that might be a diagnosis, but you can't. What am I trying to say? It becomes tricky when I feel that some people really connect and use this as a real crutch sometimes, when I wish that they could focus more on making sure that their diagnosis doesn't rule them.
Sure. I mean, one important factor is that quite often diagnosis in mental health comes a little bit late. So people experience symptoms that we don't always understand, as we said, for some time before they get to a point of receiving a diagnosis. So sometimes diagnosis can be quite liberating, because it gives you words to express, your symptoms, to express, what you've been feeling. And maybe this is the case, in some of the examples you mentioned.
The great thing about that example is that communicating wasn't a problem, and that was the best part of figuring out a solution. We spoke about it a lot, and actually she was strong enough to kind of climb out of that on her own 2 feet, and then it didn't end up being life debilitating. But obviously for others this isn't the case.
And from the way you express it sounds like you were a really good protective, and supportive factor. Maybe others want to have, that kind of a friend or support in their environment to go through that together. When we experience these quite complicated feelings in isolation, it essentially the brain interprets this experience in the same way that it interprets trauma. So it can become a traumatic experience if you are feeling, excessively low or stressed or agoraphobic or whatever else, and you don't have anyone to share this with.
So you're saying that the isolation is like a multiplying effect.
Yeah.
And you use the word trauma. that's something like what do you mean by that? So you're saying you could be exhibiting a social situation as a group and communicating, that's fine, but then in isolation this becomes a legitimate trauma to that person.
Yes. So the notion of psychological trauma is quite well established in psychiatry and mental health more generally. A traumatic experience, and that could range from experience of abuse to being in a car accident, traumatic car accident or anything in between, does have a immediate and lasting impact on how we look at certain things, how we interpret certain things, how we compose ourselves, and how we behave, because they directly impact on certain parts of the brain that regulate our behavior. So it could be, and some of the research points to that, that when we experience these risks or symptoms in isolation, the brain interprets in the same way that they interpret, for example, abuse, or when they interpret violence or an accident. So this kind of traumatic experience.
Yeah, that's pretty deep. I didn't realize that. Which is why there's some element of hope with, well, okay, maybe it's not good to say some element of hope with social media necessarily, but maybe that connection is going to have a lot of silver linings. For example, with the work you do, obviously, kind of a charity, and you're kind of going into these places, and when you look at your 2020, which obviously we're just starting, and you look at the year prior, what are the things that you feel have been most effective in your organization when you've been looking at trying to get the systemic root of this problem down? What do you think's working, and what do you think needs to be really doubled down on?
Yeah, so one of the things that's really important in mental health is activism. And I say it in the sense of giving a strong voice to people who have lived experience. And this is hugely important in our area because there is this, persistent misunderstanding of mental health problems. So when you help people get a voice on their own condition, their own experience, and you do things with them as opposed to them, this leads to more thoughtful legislation or better designed services that serve the needs of people who actually use them.
Okay.
So these are...
And forgive me again for jumping in, but you said that, you said something about the common misconceptions that play a part when you're actually trying to handle this problem. Like, just tell me a little bit about that. What are the main misconceptions that you feel are problematic when you're going down this route of solving the issues?
So, it depends on how far back we're going. Mental health, as I've told you before, has been misunderstood for centuries. We're just coming out of this, essentially. We used to lock people up, and we thought if we don't see them, maybe they don't exist, and I'm fine. So it's quite a dramatic history that doesn't exist in any other area of health. There are other areas of health that have been stigmatized, but not to that extent. Yeah. So some of the things that are misunderstood are certain symptoms. So how you develop some of these, for example, psychotic symptoms. Suicidal thoughts are still not really well understood by many people. They cannot really get their head around why a person would want to take their own life. So other things are the causes of mental health problems. We tend to be dominated by a medical model that tries to interpret everything in terms of what happens in your body, whereas there's this huge range of influences, as we've said in our environment. So also we associate mental illness quite often with weakness or with maybe some poor behaviors, or people are all responsible for their actions, especially if you think about addictions as well, when you think about alcohol and drug addictions. And things are not that simple. Things are much more complicated. And
these are factors that are really starting to stifle your work when it comes to the most effective ways of dealing with it in these recent years. Yeah. And because I kind of took you off track again there, but the most effective things that you're seeing, what do you feel they are?
So involvement is huge. It's hugely important. Legislation, I think, changes in policy. We need to look into that. We know where we've seen changes in policy, trying to, and even things like minimum wage or things like, regulating the hours that people work and policies in the workplaces like protecting against bullying and discrimination.
And these are things that you are actively going in and attacking. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Holland. I lived in Amsterdam, kind of on and off for 3 years, and I got to say they definitely have a culture which is quite heavily predisposed to part-time work. It's not really that common to have like a full-time job, and I was astounded by just the general level of happiness. Like, I mean, maybe I don't know whether that's something that is more to do with our outlook of productivity sometimes, like being English and all that. But that's something that I never really would have considered had you not said that. So when you're looking at this, you're not necessarily just going, okay, how do we look at people and their diagnosis and people suffering with, whether that's paranoia, whether that's depression. You're actually going, how does minimum wage affect things? How does the hours that you work affect things? Maybe, for example, my partner's on night shifts at the moment in the NHS. I don't know how. And it's the same way I have friends in the police as well. Like when you see these guys and girls who are expected to just switch their complete circadian rhythm around and then go and do a week, like on the streets of Hackney, and they're supposed to be aware and you just think, wow, like how is that playing a part, and how do you come out the other side of that? Even in a situation where you're actually dealing with real traumas. I mean, some of the stories, I just think, how are you not? How are you still sane? It's a real. I get how complicated and difficult this is, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, these are all very valid points, and I think there's a case to be made about sleep. Quantity and quality of sleep, hugely important.
What sort of guy are you? Are you an 8-hour guy? Or are you?
Not really, no. And in fact, I'm not a very good sleeper actually. It's a chronic issue for me as well. So I completely understand.
So when you say it's a chronic issue, what you just struggle to sleep in general?
Yeah, wake up very easily, and I might not get to sleep until late. So
and then do you get worried at the fact that you're not sleeping? Because you're like, I know the literature. I know that I need to get my sleep. So what we're saying, 5-6 hours a night?
Something like that, yeah.
Oh man. I struggle to function on I don't know why, but I think I learned very early on that sleep is a really, really big factor, because with what I do, if I'm not sleeping, my voice starts getting tired, I start getting just antsy.
That's great. That, well done. This is really important. It's quite a neglected topic.
I can imagine, because there's this stigma, especially in the industry that I'm from. In fact, it's not just the industry I'm from. It's everyone has this hyper obsession with the grind, and everyone, maybe more so young people, it's like they're seeing a lot of these influencers, they're seeing a lot of people in business, and they're just like, right, I'm going to get up at 4 a.m, like hit the gym super hard, go to bed at 1 a.m, because I'm up like working on my side hustle. And it's just like, I don't know. I definitely don't subscribe to that, but I see people that do, and you just see them just wrecking their mentalities towards the most important
the whole glamorizing of being able to function without having slept very well, which we should be doing the opposite. We should be celebrating people who sleep well. It's it's one of these fundamental biological needs.
It's not very glamorous though, is it? I got 8 hours of sleep last night. It's like rock and roll.
I know.
When we talk about this, what is it about having a really good night's sleep that because I'm assuming that the biology is understood at least at some point.
To an extent. First of all, we know that sleep is one of the fundamental, things that we need to survive. Probably don't know why, but if you think of what we need, air, water, food, sleep. As far as we know, these are the only 4 things that determine if we survive or not. So first of all, you have something quite fundamental. Second, you know that if you get a good night's sleep, you give your body the chance to recover some of the stress of the day, to sort of regulate its internal functions. And we also know that our brain tends to operate better in the hours that we are expected to be awake.
Understand? So, that makes sense.
So from a starting point, in your line of profession, you see people who perform at nights and late nights and things like that. This is already something that can be quite stressful, or something that could be you're adding a stress to your brain sometimes without even appreciating that. Yeah,
I think actually when it comes to just my experiences, the worst is the adrenaline. because it's the best thing, especially I just come back from Germany. I was on tour. I flew back on Sunday, and every night I was playing a new city, crowds of people, love it, going out, meeting people, and you get so high off it, and you kind of awake through the night, you're enjoying it, and then you come back, and obviously I keep myself fairly busy, so I'm not really complaining, but you come back, and once you lose that, and once your biological clock's totally thrown out, and your sort of circadian rhythms all messed up, it's a cloud. Like I feel it. I'm very conscious of it. I try and take the time to focus on it because I feel it in my soul. I feel this messy, cloudy, it's horrible. And I think that it's almost like a nice little point for me to kind of put my skew in it. It's like with what I do, I think a lot of people look at it and go, it's just got the best job in the world, and it's really, really great. But I can get smacked with these heavy waves and bouts of just horrendous feeling. And I think that's why I'm particularly interested in the dynamics of sleep. I'm particularly interested in the dynamics of diet, because I know that the mornings when I get up early, get a bit of exercise in me, good night's sleep, when I'm eating well, I feel it. And I'm sure everyone, people listening feel the same, especially as I start to research a little bit ahead of this talk and go into this paper about how your kind of gut microbes that deal with inflammation in your body, they now have this almost linear relationship to rates of depressive thoughts, and there's now drawing these conclusions, and maybe I'm getting the wrong end of the stick again, but the conclusions that actually diet, sugar, inflammation in the body has this very direct relationship with the level of your mental health.
It does, and you're making a great point. And I think the fact that you, for yourself, you appreciate that, this is quite important. You appreciate the value of sleeping well, or you understand why you may not feel very well if you haven't had good sleep or good food or whatever else. But one mistake that we often make is that we try to separate our mental health from our physical health, from our, how our bodies work and what's happening within our bodies. And we try to take mental health into a completely different realm of being something entirely separate. And that's not true. As you say, inflammation, stress, and also in the sense of physical stress, things like pain and tiredness, these are intrinsically linked with our mental health and our emotions, and how are we feeling, our best selves, can we perform at our best?
Would it be too simplistic to say, well, our diet these days, especially sort of like Western culture, I mean, it's very sugar heavy. Is this something that maybe isn't being considered enough? It's like if we have a really heavy sugar-induced diet all the time, we're seeing this big correlation. Okay, maybe I'm a little bit misinformed there, but we see this seemingly rising tide of mental health issues. This must be a strong factor that we need to raise awareness on, maybe.
Yeah, it is an important factor. It is. There's research that very clearly shows if you, and actually it's more common for men, if you are not eating well for, very fast food, sugary diets for long periods of time, higher rates of depression.
Why more common in men? Because we're less in tune with our diet than women?
Possibly. If you look at some of these studies, they're really interesting, especially, studies looking into men who are single, men who are in couples, women who are in couples, women who are single. You see the worst outcomes are from men who are single or men who are separated things like that. Yeah,
I can kind of get that.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I can totally understand that. I think that we sometimes, what's the best way of putting this? Look, I can be a slob sometimes. Sure. If I've got the house to myself and I'm there and I've got the beers in the fridge.
Yeah, I get it.
I can go off the rails. I'm talking like big old slabs of chocolate, get the Ben and Jerry's. Like, it's not good. And I think that maybe at least the women I know in my circles are a lot more methodical and conscious about that. And blokes, I don't know, we're just a bit more. We're just terrible with that stuff.
Totally, yeah, I get it. Yeah,
maybe that's a bit of a generalization. I mean, I'm sure women can.
But
do the same.
It is more common. It's not the case for everyone, but it is more common. And this is what research shows. but we also have, I think there's a case to be made about the link between mental health and obesity more generally. There's a lot of interest in obesity at the moment.
There's an interest in obesity in the correlation to mental health.
Not so much. But it is quite an interesting topic for me because if you look at the various causes of obesity that starts from overeating, if you like, for long periods of time. Overeating is a form of coping. It could be similar to some people, drinking excessively or any other drug addictions. So there's a mental health component right there. So you have, this is a response to your distress or stress or any other emotions you have. Also, there's something about obesity and how it is treated in our society, how it is perceived. People who are obese are perceived as lazy. They're perceived as really responsible for, how they look and as failing to look a certain way. So again, a huge mental health component when we think about body image and when you think about the impact of that. So we tend to say in public health that we live in another piece of jargon here, obesogenic environment. So an environment that really pushes us to become obese because you go to the supermarket and right next to the till you have these chocolates, or you go into the high street cafes and most of it, like 80% of the snacks are muffins cakes and things like that. And you're not really encouraged to eat healthily, and fast food is much cheaper than healthy food. You can get burgers for £1 for crying out loud. So it's there's a big connection. So you see these problems, obesity and mental health problems, rising at the same time.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because my brain's split in two. I mean, obviously it's your own responsibility and you have to try and take ownership of the things you do, but I see exactly what you mean. It's we're not all in that luxury position of having nutritional education. It's not something that unless I think you're gonna seek it out and understand it. And you're right. You see the KFCs, you see the Burger Kings, you say the 99p McFlurries and Happy Meals. It's just like, well, yeah. And if you don't happen to have that toolbox of knowledge, of course you're going to be jamming yourself full of 4,000 calories a day, times that by 5 years, and is there? I'm assuming that over the years there's always been campaigns, there's always been pressure, there's been sugar taxes, there's been all sorts. I mean, people are going to fundamentally, they're gonna enjoy their addictions, aren't they? I mean, I believe I'm clinically addicted to sugar, for example. And I say that as half joke, but I'm being sincere. I almost need sugar each day, and I realize I'm like, holy shit! I actually can't curb this.
It's my guilty pleasure. I understand what you mean.
But look at you, you're slim. You obviously exercise.
Well, you as well, but it's
I don't know, getting a few pounds since Christmas. But it's a tough one, isn't it? Because I have the toolkit. I'm relatively knowledgeable. I have enough knowledge to know that this stuff's bad for me. But that thing in my mind, that little kind of chimp mechanism that goes, right, time to go hunt for some sugar. It's unbelievably powerful.
It's a quick fix. We feel good for these few minutes. It's easy to access. There's a much more powerful advertising industry behind it. I get it. So some of these things are they become subconscious for all of us. No matter how well educated and alert you are, they still become a little bit subconscious. If you look at kids, some of the children go to in a football team or whatever else, they go to play in the field, and the advertising on the side is McDonald's or anything else, and so you are thinking. Everyone says you should exercise, so that's what I'm doing now, and because it's healthy for you. And while I'm doing this healthy thing, I see all these ads there. So this also, I'm associating this with something that's good and healthy for me. So you. I
never thought of it like that.
Exactly. So you're growing up with all these conflicting messages. Yeah,
that is.
It's difficult to avoid that.
I mean, is that something that you think they actively do? Do you think that's something that McDonald's goes, okay, I tell you what, guys, we can be a bit sneaky here. We can go and pay whatever the hell they want. We'll make sure we're at the Super Bowls. We'll make sure we're on the halftime shows. You think they're purposefully paying whatever it costs to associate and align their brand with active?
All our evidence shows that they are. The evidence from tobacco industry, which has been studied really well.
I watched the documentary recently about the I'm trying to remember the name, the vaping things, and they were doing the studies of how how deep the psychological manipulation of placement of like Marlborough, for example, it's just next level. The depth that they think of how to screw with people, it's nuts.
And when the evidence emerged about the fact that smoking is actually bad for you, in the 50s and 60s, the tobacco
predominantly
companies,
by research done by the tobacco companies as well. Like they had the jump, didn't they?
When they started seeing those stuff, I think which they were not necessarily we were not necessarily expecting at some point. There is a clear shift to advertising based on doubt. So from cigarettes being the product, doubt becomes the product, and they start undermining research. They start undermining the evidence. We start seeing sentences like, I had a granddad who was smoking his whole life and he died in his 90s. So smoking must not be bad for you. It's the same with some of these industries as well, and the impact on mental health. There is a connection there. There is a connection because these are harmful products.
Jesus, that's scary, isn't it? What's up, yes? Oh, has it? Oh, okay, cool. Thanks. Let us know. I mean, that's a biggie. That's a biggie, and I've got to say that's quite a bombshell in my mind because I never really drew that link, but I have no doubt that they go to those levels for sure. That's pretty intense. So when it comes to things like whether it's sugar taxing, whether it's trying to change legislation about nutritional information, do you think that can be the answer? And to sort of kind of pose my question a little bit better, if we employ these levies, let's say we make burgers more expensive, for example, do you think in actual fact that it's always going to revolve down to the individual responsibility because people are just going to pay what they want to pay? I mean, if there was a massive chunk of like chocolate out there and I was craving it, I'd probably pay 20 quid for it because I'm just like, I'm going to have it regardless. Do you think that kind of systemic approach is going to be productive in what you're trying to do here?
Well, our evidence shows that it is. When you increase pricing and when you give certain incentives to companies to reduce, for example, sugar levels and things like that, consumption goes down. There are two things for me from a scientific perspective, and from the stuff that I've seen and done over the years. One, we need to protect people from direct harm with legislation and policy. And second, we need to educate, and inform them in a way that is accessible and in language that everyone understands, because not everyone, understands the same kind of, language. And I don't mean language in the, in the sense of from which country you are, but in the sense of how you consume your information. Yeah. So we have to
in
do
a way
both.
That's kind of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to have a bit more of a kind of easier, pragmatic discussion about it.
So once you do that, once you educate people, and once you also protect them from some direct harms, as we said, we cannot just put everything under a glass bowl or a dome and just say we'll protect you from everything. That's not what we can do. But you need a combination, and then let people make their own choices. And chances are, if you live in an environment that is more thoughtful about your health, that you will also start making healthier choices. But there is a level of protection that we need to support our communities with.
Completely understandable. And when it comes to the organization, when it comes to your future, when it comes to raising awareness, how can people kind of learn a bit more about what you do and potentially even support what you're doing here? If there's people connecting with your message, how can they find out more about you? Yeah,
so we have essentially everything that I've spoken about, is in some shape or form on our website, in the Mental Health Foundation website. But we do engage a lot on social media. And the URL
that is mentalhealth.org.
WK, exactly. We do engage a lot in social media. That's a good way of getting our latest news and the stuff that we're doing. And another good way to engage is actually through Mental Health Awareness Week, which we've been running since 2001. It's the biggest campaign of its kind in the world. It's quite a big deal. And it's a good way to sort of engage with our messaging and our work, but also do your own thing, around mental health and raising awareness, but also taking action. So I would say, across the board, whatever is easier, I think it's useful to engage in different forums.
Well, look, I'm sure I'm going to be calling you up in a couple of months and doing this again, but I've got to say a very special thank you for coming and doing this. I've really learned a lot, and I appreciate your time.
Oh, real pleasure, and looking forward to doing it again.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant.